A single frame, frozen in time, can capture what statistics never will: the fear, the confusion, the sacrifice, and sometimes, a much deeper truth. Across more than a century of conflict, a small number of photographs have come to shape how we understand war itself, not through maps or battlefield movements, but through the raw, human experience of those who lived it. Long before modern cameras could freeze an explosion in mid-air or track a soldier in mid-stride, photography was already quietly dismantling the romanticized myths of combat. During the Crimean War, pioneers like Roger Fenton brought back the first widely seen images of life on the edge of the abyss. But the technology of the 1850s was a cumbersome, agonizingly slow beast. Because cameras required long exposure times, the frantic blur of genuine combat was impossible to capture. If a subject moved, they vanished into a ghost. As a result, these early photographs were scrubbed of the visceral violence of the bayonet charge. Instead, the public saw orderly camps, stoic officers, and silent landscapes scarred by iron and gunpowder. Yet, despite the stillness of the frames, a fundamental shift had occurred. For the first time in history, the home front was no longer reliant on the flowery prose of journalists or the dramatic imagination of painters. Civilians could look directly into the eyes of the men sent to fight in their name. By the time the First World War tore across Europe, the silent landscapes of the Crimea had given way to something more urgent. Cameras were shrinking, exposure times were dropping, and for the first time, photographers were venturing into the mud and wire of the front lines. Yet, even in 1916, the truth remained elusive. The cameras of the Great War were still fragile, temperamental machines, and the chaotic slaughter of trench warfare was almost impossible to capture as it unfolded. To the lens, a real charge was often nothing more than a blur of smoke and disappearing men. To bridge this gap, the images that reached the public were often meticulously curated, or manufactured entirely. One of the most enduring images of the era is a photograph known as Over the Top. It captures the definitive moment of the war: British soldiers scrambling from the safety of a trench, rifles gripped tight, surging toward the enemy with cinematic resolve. It feels breathless, raw, and immediate. But the heroism was a performance. Captured by official photographer John Warwick Brooke, the scene was staged well behind the lines. It was designed to project a specific vision of the conflict to the families back home, one of discipline, grit, and purposeful momentum. It replaced the terrifying randomness of the machine gun with an image of a war that was organized, heroic, and firmly under control. It was a powerful lie. The photograph gave civilians a window into the war, but the glass was tinted. The true, shattered reality waiting beyond the parapet remained a secret kept by the men who actually climbed over it. By the Second World War, war photography had changed dramatically. Cameras were now smaller, lighter, and fast enough to capture moments as they happened, allowing photographers to move far closer to the fighting than ever before. By April 1945, Nazi Germany was a crumbling ruin. Allied forces were surging into the heart of German cities, and for the exhausted soldiers on the front lines, the promise of peace was finally close enough to touch. Yet, the momentum of war is a heartless thing. Even in the final hours, the dying did not stop. In Leipzig, legendary war photographer Robert Capa followed American troops as they fought to seize a bridge under the frantic gaze of snipers. Seeking a vantage point, a machine gun crew ducked into an apartment overlooking the street, setting up on a balcony to cover the advance below. Then, in the small, mundane window of time it took to reload his weapon, 21-year-old Raymond J. Bowman was struck by a sniper's bullet. Capa stepped into the room only moments later. His lens captured a scene of jarring, domestic horror. Bowman's body lying motionless in the doorway, blood pooling across the polished wooden floor, while a fellow soldier steps over him to return to the balcony and continue the fight. Life had ended in a stranger's living room just as the rest of the world was preparing to celebrate. The image would be remembered as the picture of the last man to die. Bowman was not literally the final casualty of the conflict, but the photograph struck a nerve because of its sheer pointlessness. It remains a haunting testament to the cruelest irony of combat, that the machinery of war keeps grinding and killing long after the victory has already been won. By May 1945, Berlin had been reduced to ruins as Soviet forces fought street by street toward the center of the collapsing Third Reich. Amid the destruction, photographer Yevgeny Khalday captured what would become one of the most recognizable images of the Second World War: Soviet soldiers raising the hammer and sickle above the Reichstag. The photograph symbolized far more than the capture of a building. To the Soviet Union, it represented the final defeat of Nazi Germany and the end of years of devastating war across the Eastern Front. But like many famous wartime images, the photograph was not as straightforward as it first appeared. The battle for the Reichstag had already largely concluded by the time the image was taken, and the flag raising itself was recreated for the camera using several soldiers posing atop the building. The identities of the men in the photograph, and who had first raised the Soviet banner over the Reichstag, became subjects of confusion and political debate for decades afterward. Even so, the image endured, not simply as a record of an event, but as a carefully constructed symbol of victory at the end of one of history's deadliest wars. By the time of the Vietnam War, photography had undergone a transformation. Advances in camera technology made it possible to capture events as they happened, and for the first time, images from the battlefield could reach a global audience almost immediately. War was no longer distant or abstract. It was visible, direct, and unavoidable. In 1968, during the Tet Offensive, photographer Eddie Adams captured a moment that would become one of the most recognizable images of the conflict. A South Vietnamese general stands in a street, facing a prisoner who has been brought before him. There is no warning, no formal process, and no hesitation. The general raises his pistol and fires. The photograph freezes the exact instant of execution, capturing both the physical impact on the prisoner and the calm composure of the man pulling the trigger. For many viewers, this image came to define the Vietnam War, not in terms of strategy or ideology, but in terms of its raw and immediate brutality. Years later, Adams himself would reflect on the photograph, stating that it did not tell the full story of the individuals involved. The man who fired the shot, he argued, was far more complex than the image had suggested. But by that point, the photograph had already shaped public perception. And in war, public perception can carry as much weight as reality itself. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey through history's most powerful war photographs, be sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next story.